Hello again. Today we're talking to Michael Ventura about Charlie Chaplin, and we're both pretty big fans of Charlie Chaplin. And Michael introduced Charlie Chaplin movies to me, and he knows very, very much about Charlie Chaplin. So why don't uh, why don't you take it from there, Michael? I don't know where you want to start, but go ahead.
Well, actually, the place to start, as I've found out in my research these last years, really with Chaplin, is 3 years before he ever made a film, and it's not with Charlie Chaplin, but with Max Sennett and Mabel Normand. Now, D.W. Griffith was filming out of the Biograph Company in Manhattan, and most of their filming was in New Jersey. And Max Sennett had come to the Biograph Company. He'd been in all kinds of showbiz. And Griffith saw in him, Griffith knew that he himself had no sense of humor. And Griffith saw in Sennett possibilities, and he gave Sennett the responsibility of making the Biograph Company comedies, mostly one-reelers. And this has been a neglected part of film scholarship, but in the last 15 years, many films have become available on DVD because digital transfer is a great deal easier than transferring from film to tape, and it's more complete. There's been a lot of film restoration. So some of the Max Sennett Biographs comedies are available, about 20 or 30 of them. I mean, they made many films, like a film a week, mostly one-reelers. And the person Max Sennett discovered was Mabel Normand. She was part of the Biograph Company. Griffith didn't like her much in terms of starring. He liked the Lillian Gish type better. I mean, not to put Lillian Gish down, she was a great film actress. But we first see Mabel Normand in a Griffith film. The earliest Mabel Normand was in a Griffith film, a one-reeler, and it's titled Fate's Turning. And it's just a little melodrama, little love melodrama. And Mabel Normand plays a girl just sitting in a cafe. She's just one of the extras. And you can see that she's the only person on the screen having a direct relationship with the camera. She's about 15 or 16 when she's in this film. The age of consent, by the way, for our culture now is 18, was 16 in 1911. It's 16 in a lot of parts of Europe. So, but and she had been making her own living as a artist model since she was 14, and in the way things were advertised in those days was largely through magazine illustrations and billboards. And Mabel Normand was posed for drawings with Coca-Cola. She's in some famous Coca-Cola ads and all kinds of products for magazine illustrators to do advertisements. And then she found herself at the Biograph because for the adventure of it, I think. And she was a person who didn't like to stand still. She had to stand still a lot for the artists. So, in posing. So, in this film, you see her, she's in two brief scenes, but you notice her instead of the stars because she has a very direct relationship with the camera. And that was new to film, having this direct eye-to-eye relationship with the camera. Max Sennett had a good eye, and he felt for her, but he also starred her in his comedies so she became the first comedy star, the first female comedy star. And the films they made were actually very radical in a funny way. For instance, there's a short called Them Their Eyes from 1912. And she plays the pretty girl that she is, and all these men are running around after her and proposing to her and this and that. And then she ends up with a bear. I know that sounds weird, sounds surreal, but she does end up with a bear cub. When, after she's accepted the proposals of two different men, she rejects them both, and there's a bear that just comes on very surreally, and she plays with the bear. And something you find in these early films is that animals were a part of the films, and people played with bears, with lions, with no protection. Amazingly, very few people got hurt. But in the Max Sennett, Mabel Normand films, you see something that's very new in film. You see the 20th century being filmed. Mabel Normand was the first actor to be in a film with an airplane. And then you're talking about a biplane, and she and the pilot are sitting on the bottom wing, and this was extraordinary for the time. There's some close-up shots. You see her taking off of the plane. You see her landing in the plane. When you think about a lot of people who saw the film had never seen a plane before. There's other films where she's driving. A lot of people had never seen a woman drive. Most people in the country didn't know how to drive. So Max Sennett and Mabel Normand were creating a new kind of comedy, a kind of 20th century comedy. There's a film where she plays a movie star, and Max Sennett plays somebody in the theater who falls in love with her as a movie star. People go to the movies in Max Sennett films. People drive cars. There are fire engines and fire wagons pulled by horses. There's the 20th century. And it was a big draw for the people who were paying, like a nickel, 10 cents. You had 10% of the country was from 10% of the population of this country circa 1912, 13, 14, was from somewhere else. And they were mostly in the big cities. A lot of them couldn't speak English. And this medium, the silent film, especially the silent comedy, became immensely popular because there was this audience for it. And an audience, interestingly enough, that enjoyed absurdity. Absurd human behavior made them laugh, but really laugh. Perhaps because it was a transition from the Victorian era, perhaps because manners were much more straight-laced at the time. You'll find in 1912, for instance, if you look at documentary footage of 1912 in the United States or Europe, women are clothed literally from head to foot. And they're wearing hats. Often their necks are covered by fluffy collars that come up from their blouses. They're even wearing gloves. The only part of the face, of the skin that's exposed, is the face. You'll find, largely through the movies at the time, that totally changes over the next 6 or 7 years. Clothing changes, hair changes. Mabel Normand had a lot to do with that. Gloria Swanson, again, another teenager making her first film. She's 16 when she starts films. Had a lot to do with that. And Mabel Normand's behavior, you can compare her somewhat, for instance, to Sandra Bullock, in that she's beautiful and she's a comedian, where Lucille Ball, who was beautiful, who could be beautiful off-screen or in her early pictures, plays somebody awkward, somebody who's not playing for attractiveness. You'll find a lot of female comics doing that. But Mabel looked like the pretty girl she was, and was just, as somebody said later, Mabel was just Mabel. And she had this technique of acting that was not vaudeville. She'd never been on the stage. It was purely a relationship with the camera. Naturalistic, not mugging the way a lot of early silent film comedians did, and intimate. So the legend goes that Mabel Normand and Max Sennett went to the theater. They saw this English road company called Carnot's, and they saw this young man, Charlie Chaplin, on the stage, and they thought he'd be terrific in films. And we don't really know if it was Mac, if it was Mabel. There's 3 or 4 versions of this story, but it's definite that they saw him on the stage, and it's definite that they wanted him. He got a telegram, reached him as the Carnot troupe was going across the country, offering him the amazing amount of $125 a week to come and be a Keystone performer. And that was way more money than he'd ever been paid. When you're thinking that $10, $15 a week was considered pretty good money for a 6-day, 12-hour-a-day work week, $125 a week was amazing. And more than Chaplin had ever made. And Chaplin left the Carnot and showed up at the Keystone. Now, his replacement at the Carnot company was a young man named Stan Laurel, who later would become one of the great silent film comedians as well, with partnering up with Oliver Hardy. I actually think the Stan Laurel, Oliver Hardy films, both silent and sound, are funnier.
Yeah.
Just for outright funnier than anybody else's.
Yeah.
And, where they may not be profound, but you laugh. and yet they're usually people, the critics talk about Chaplin and Harold Lloyd and Buster Keaton, of course, but really, Stan Laurel and Oliver Hardy, for me, if you just want to laugh, any collection of their stuff is great. In any case, not to digress. So Chaplin comes to the Keystone, and he doesn't get it. Already films are being shot in terms of production out of sequence. You have one scene shot because if you have a certain set, you're going to shoot all the scenes of that set, and then you're going to go to another setup, another location, and shoot all those scenes. And he's not used to that at all, because the theater is sequential. Filming a silent film is not necessarily sequential.
Yeah.
It's more sequential than it was later in the studios, but it's not very sequential at the time compared to theater. And this looks like a ragtag place. It's on what now is Glendale Boulevard. It was Alessandro back then. In what now is Silver Lake. It was all called Edendale back then. And a trolley ran down this wide, dirt-packed street. And behind this fence was basically a little farm. It had been a farm. The main building was the farm. farmhouse. People had set up dressing rooms in the barn. Same thing with when Cecil B. DeMille came to town, roughly that same year, but a little bit later, not 1913, so a little bit before. The barn was at Hollywood and Vine. The farm was in between Sunset and Hollywood Boulevards, and it was all trees. It was all this farm, and DeMille occupied that farmhouse. In the same way, the Max Sennett studio grew up around a farmhouse. And Chaplin was quite confused about the whole thing. He didn't know about anything except the money. So the first film he makes, it was a 9-minute film. It's called Making a Living. He's not playing Charlie, the man we've seen, the figure we've seen on the screen. He's playing a toff, as they call him, T-O-F-F. And he is acting very broadly. It's a very broad character. He's sort of a villain. The comedy is very broad. But they were really giving him a big welcome that he didn't understand. Because it's a 9-minute film, and I've counted 24 camera setups, in this 9-minute film. The stunts are outrageous, and everybody's doing their own stunts. There's no stuntman yet. And you see people falling down the stairs. You see incredible falls, incredible fights. Ends up on a hill in downtown L.A. with the fight that ended up in a trolley car. And one thing you'll see with the Keystone films is they don't really end. They just stop. There's some kind of pause in the action. That's the end of the film. And Chaplin thought it was awful. And he always described this film as a really bad picture. Actually, it got terrific reviews. Films had just begun to be reviewed. And reviewers thought that this guy was really something. And his next film, he was going to be, trying to get it in my head, excuse that moment of silence. His next film was called Mabel's Strange Predicament. It's not really known who composed the film, the scenario, but Mabel directed it. And now she's younger than Chaplin, about 19. He's about 23, 24. It's late 1913, early 1914. He doesn't like being directed by a woman. In fact, a lot of them didn't like this 5-foot-tall pretty girl bossing him around. But she did something that would change, would give him the insight into how to perform for a camera. Now he's going to be not a tramp, but he's going to be somebody at odds in a hotel. He doesn't really know what to do with himself. He's not broke. He pays for things. This character is kind of described to him. And he asks Chester Conklin, there are various versions of this, but the ones that's most consistent. He asks Chester Conklin, who's even smaller than he is, if he can wear his vest. He asks Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle, if he can wear his pants. He gets big shoes. He wants contrasts. He wants baggy pants, tight vest. Comedy often works by contrast. He gets a cane. He puts on a derby that kind of fits. And he said later he just felt the character. He puts on this little mustache. That he just felt possibilities in the character. He was kind of shocked at himself. That he felt business, as they call it, biz, as they called it in those days, that didn't make much sense even to himself. But he just felt it was natural in this character. So you see him, when he comes on in Mabel's Strange Predicament, you see Mabel come to the hotel and check in, a woman checking in alone. It doesn't look radical to us, but it was incredibly shocking at the time. And you see people around her shocked by this young woman checking in alone. Just being there alone means that she must be improper in some sort of way. And the audience certainly got that message. But she's just breezing along. And then the film shifts from her, and you're looking at Chaplin just having nothing much to do in the lobby. In the lobby, there's a spittoon, near a chair. He's flirting with some girls. This happens, that happens. But it's not broad. The camera's close to him. It isn't the mugging that he was doing in the first film. Because in the first film, it's like he was playing in a theater, and he was playing for the back row. Mabel had the camera pretty close to him, and he was doing kind of a solo, just improvisation of what to do, this. She kept the camera pretty tight on him and on herself in this picture. And it was his introduction to really acting for the camera. And over the course of the year, when he started very soon making his own pictures, several with Mabel, they sort of co-directed by then, he gets the hang of that kind of filming, of being a presence to the camera. And you'll see him do in these 1914 Keystone films, he's not set on the character of Charlie. Sometimes Charlie has money and dresses nice. Sometimes he doesn't. He's experimenting. Now, in the second film that he made for a director whose nickname was Pathé, because that was the name of a French comedy company that was making very successful comedies in France and were shown all over the world. Pathé Lerman. He was a guy from Brooklyn. And nobody has anything good to say about this guy. But he was a good director. And anybody will say that. He directed Chaplin's first film, Making a Living, that we've spoken about. Chaplin hated his guts. Then after the film Mabel's Strange Predicament, and Mabel's Strange Predicament is, then he makes this second film with Lehman that critics have not understood because they didn't have there wasn't the material necessary for them to understand it. Film companies, including Keystone, put out what were called actualities, little documentaries of stuff that had never been filmed. For instance, Keystone made actualities about how to make a movie. Keystone made an actuality about an ostrich farm. There were 3 ostrich farms in Los Angeles at the time, in that general area. Don't ask me why or how or what, but they were ostriches, and Keystone made an actuality of that. Actuality of all kinds of things. Every company did. They were usually a half reel, which meant they were about, you could put them, an actuality would be like 5 minutes of a reel, and then the next 10, 15 minutes would be the one reel comedy. A reel at that time might last 20 minutes, and it's very rarely that you had, actually no, I'm sorry, a reel might last like 15 minutes. A 2-reel comedy, which started to be made in 14, that was rare at first. Comedies were 1 reels. And brilliant idea, actually. He was going to make an actuality of kid auto races in Venice, California. These were not real cars. They were made to look like real cars. They were kid size. They were set at the top of a long ramp and came off quite fast and got a big crowd to watch them. And what you see on the screen first is this guy. He's just a guy. He looks a little weird with the hat and the cane and the big pants, but you don't know that it's not an actuality. The crowd is being panned. You'll see some people hiding their faces from the camera. And then you see this guy. And a real cop kind of shoos him off. And he does a little kind of dance. And he's looking at the camera all of a sudden. And then you realize that the camera is a character. And you realize that when you're seeing the camera and you're seeing the director, and the director is trying to get this guy out of the way, this Chaplin. And it becomes this struggle between the director wanting to get a shot of the kid auto races and this guy, this impish guy, who keeps wanting to be filmed by the camera. And it ends up in just 5 to 6 minutes with a huge close-up of Charlie sneering into the camera. That was the public's first view of Charlie Chaplin, the Charlie Chaplin we know. Now, for a long time, scholars thought it was the first Chaplin movie, but no, it was the second Chaplin movie as Charlie, because the first was a much more complicated, Mabel's strange predicament, and that took time to edit, where Kid Auto Races in Venice could be edited in a matter of a couple hours. So it came out first, and that was the initial Charlie film. Over the year of 1914, you saw Chaplin experimenting with all kinds of facets of this character in films that were watched and loved, really, for their mayhem. They don't seem funny ha-ha today. I mean, there's funny things in it, and once you get used to the medium, you find yourself laughing more than when you first see the films. And the Keystone films are not considered artful, and yet you'll see a lot of things in them that aren't in other films until later, in other productions. Max Sennett said that all jokes are old, and there are only a few of them. And that's certainly true of film comedy. There's always the chase. You know, if you see a film like Peter Bogdanovich's What's Up, Doc, with Barbra Streisand and Ryan O'Neal, it's a Max Sennett film, done very wonderfully. It uses all the trophies of a Max Sennett film, or tropes as they're called. I don't know what they're called. And in 1914, you see a Chaplin who's excited at everything, who's reacting to everything, a Chaplin who's much more mysterious than he'd ever be again, a Chaplin who's much more of a lech than he'd ever be again, in terms of he's always always ogling women, always after women. Some of them are after him. And you see the awakening of the Charlie Chaplin character. There would be, within just literally a couple of months, Chaplin is taking off. He's made like 6 or 7 films, and he is becoming famous in a way that nobody had ever become famous before. He is theaters, they'd have a poster that just said, "He's here again," and there's a big photograph of Charlie, and he's here again, and everybody knew what that meant. So he's becoming famous in a way that, as I said, nobody had ever become famous before. By the end of the year, 35 pictures, he's the most famous person in the world. He's known the world over. And not only is he the most famous person in the world, but he's famous in a way nobody ever became famous before, the world over. And he's probably more famous than anybody had ever been up to that time. It's only in the early 20th century that photographs can be printed in newspapers and magazines. Before that, it was drawings and daguerreotypes. But people know Charlie Chaplin. He's an icon, suddenly recognizable. His films are playing all over the world, all over anywhere where they can get a projector, because a lot of the world hasn't even been explored yet, circa 1914. Now, toward the middle of 1914, Max Sennett gets this idea that for a feature-length comedy. And his backers in New York said he was crazy. There'd never been a feature-length comedy. They were doing feature films in Europe, and had been for about 10 years. The first feature film to be shot in feature-length film, like 5 reels, to be shot in California, had just been finished. It was Cecil B. DeMille's The Virginian, a Western. And there were films being, Italian feature films, big productions of Rome kind of things, that kind of thing. There were French feature films. Alice Guy had made a feature film about Jesus, very elegantly done, 1906 or so. Another French director, circa 1912, 1913, had made an elegantly done film called A Child of Paris, Enfant de Paris, that you can see in the Gaumont, Gaumont collection, Volume 1. Elegant film. It was about 2 hours long. It was a drama. Not a melodrama, really. I mean, it was a drama. And so this stuff was going on when D.W. Griffith got his idea to even do a feature film when he saw some of the Italian feature films. But nobody had made a comedy. And Sennett had the audacious idea to make a 5 or 6 reel comedy. He got a Broadway star, Marie Dressler, who was, unlike most of the actors, like the silent films people tried to get from Broadway in the teens for their prestige, Dressler was a natural at film. She understood the medium instantly. And she had made a hit on Broadway with a character called Tilly, and this film would be called Tilly's Punctured Romance. Chaplin doesn't play Charlie. He plays a kind of villain. He has a cane, he has a hat, but it's not the Charlie hat, kind of a straw skimmer. Mabel Norman plays his girl. And he's a con man and a pickpocket. Mabel Norman is his moll and co-conspirator and co-thief. And something that you heard that was an archetype, kind of, in the early 20th century, is the girl from the country coming to the big city and working. And there was a very popular song at the time, "Heaven Will Protect the Working Girl." You had seamstresses, all kinds of jobs. You had something that was completely new, which was that people could have careers. Mabel Norman was very radical for her time because even when she was, before she became a model, she looked around the world and she wanted to have a career. She saw other women doing it. Well, Cather was writing for magazines, etc. So here was this country person coming to the city. It was part of a big social upheaval that was going on. A mainly agricultural country was in the beginning of becoming a mainly urban suburban country.
Yeah.
And Max Sennett was interested in the 20th century. You see that in his films. He was interested in showing people his version of the 20th century. He was interested in observing the 20th century. So he makes a 5-reel comedy, and he had the people to do it in this sense. He had Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle, a wonderful comic in his own right. He had Chester Conklin, Hank Mann, who was Max Swain. I'm blanking on names, but men and women who were just marvelous at what they did. And he had a background troupe, plus the Keystone Cops that he came up with,
right,
that had been in films already, in his films, but they'd become with Tilly's Punctured Romance, they become iconic. They become a force in the film, and the plot is very, very simple. Chaplin happens to meet this farm girl, and the farm girl, and he happens to see where the farmer keeps the money, and he convinces the farm girl to steal from her father, who you're seeing the father beat her. You're seeing it done as comedy, some very real and upsetting situations, but always as comedy. They go to the city. He wants to steal her money. He steals her money. He brings it to the mall. The mall likes that he stole the money. Doesn't like that he's with this other woman. One thing happens, and another thing happens, and another thing happens. Ends up in a big chase with the cops chasing everybody. And it's 5 reels long. And it costs $50,000 to make. That's like, I don't know how much money today. It's amazing money. And Sennett had to basically promise his backers that if it failed, they'd own everything, because the short comedies were making a ton of money. And so it's the last time that Chaplin was directed by somebody else, except Tilly's Punctured Romance was produced by Max Sennett. But Max Sennett was also producing 2 shorter comedies a week, plus doing Tilly. So sometimes when Mac was busy on a shorter comedy, he had Roscoe Arbuckle direct one. He'd be directing Tilly. Other people on the lot who could direct. So it was really kind of a chorus of directors on Tilly's Punctured Romance. But it comes out in December. It's the first feature comedy ever. It makes Chaplin even a bigger star. So Chaplin leaves Sennett for more money at a group called S&A out of Chicago. Signs a contract of more money than any performer had ever been given ever, and for X number of films, I forget exactly how many. And Chaplin's career begins. But if you Chaplin makes for Keystone. And finally, you can look at them in decent prints, because about 10 years ago, a collection was made, a box set, Chaplin at Keystone, and it is 4 discs, more than 30 films, better than you've seen them, than they've been seen since the original prints first hit the screen. There's the most complete print of Tilly's Punctured Romance that's ever been available, and since it came out. And you can see Chaplin discovering the character. You can see his collaborations with the likes of Chester Conklin and Hank Mann. You can see his collaborations with Mabel Norman. There's a film called Gentlemen of Nerve with Max Swain and Chester Conklin and Mabel and Charlie. And the last several minutes of it, especially the very last 30 seconds of it, you see an exchange between Charlie and Mabel that's just not comedy, not drama, not a love story, not a love story. 2 people, young people, she's 19, he's about 24, having the time of their lives in this new medium, which they are both discovering and creating. And just an exchange between them that is so happy and sweet, with nothing feigned, just happiness. About 15, 20 seconds of it at the end of that film that I think is some of the most marvelous footage of 2 people that has ever been shot. The film is Gentlemen of Nerve. It's one of the last films they made together. And it's a funny picture, and it's at a racetrack. Max Sennett liked filming cars. And there you are, and it's late in 1914. Now, the context of all this, since August 1914, Europe plunged into a war that in October, in one battle, or a couple of battles in October saw a casualty count on all sides of 500,000. That had never happened before. There'd never been the technology to kill 500,000 people in just a few weeks. And so on the one hand, you had this newness at the Senate lot that was just delighting in mayhem. It doesn't look funny ha-ha now, not all of it. Or some of it does. Most of it doesn't look funny ha-ha. But if you're looking for just
zaniness,
and how they were perceiving their own time, a comic version of what it felt like to them, and how things were already falling apart. According to a Keystone film, the worst thing you could do for a marriage is take a walk in the park. A lot of them were filmed in Echo Park, up in Griffith Park. The worst thing you could do, because either the wife or the husband or both were going to start looking at other people, and mayhem would ensue. In film after film after film. And you had this burst of a new art in North America especially. You had this burst of comedy coming out of the Keystone. And at the same time, you had European society falling off a cliff and really never to be the same. And I find that era and those films as part of that era full of, not innocence, because these people weren't babes in the woods, but eagerness for life, eagerness for sensation, eagerness for the medium they were working in. This was all brand new. As I'm not the first to say, in nearly every film, something would be done that hadn't been done before. Something would come alive that, oh, we can do this, we can do that, we can do the other thing.
Yeah.
Chester Conklin and Charlie Chaplin in a bakery. There's a bakery across the street, Greenberg's, and they start thinking about comedy stuff in the bakery. They run back to the Keystone across the street and start getting Chaplin starts ordering the carpenters to make this set, make that set. And 2 weeks later, you have a film called Dough and Dynamite, which holds up today very, very well. And again, like most Keystone films, it doesn't really end; it just stops. So
before we end for today, take about 10 minutes and give me a little character sketch of Charlie Chaplin, just his personality and what he was like off screen and in real life, and anybody else that like Max Sennett or Fatty Arbuckle.
Well, it was Charles Chaplin in 1914. He was short, he was curly haired, he was olive skinned, and he'd come from a background of poverty, extreme.
Mm-hmm.
His mother was mentally ill. His father split the scene. He had a half-brother called Sid. They were both in the Carno Company. His brother Sid was older. Once Chaplin became his own businessman, in effect, and was doing his being the highest paid actor and all that, his brother Sid became his manager, confidant, everything. It was a very close relationship between them. They trusted each other completely. And Sid was an actor in his own right. Sid was the first one of the Chaplin brothers to be in the Carno Company and got Charlie in. When Charlie was 9 years old, probably less, he was doing tricks for people for pennies. He was a little barefoot ragamuffin, making pennies to take home to his mother.
And he came from his family background was a certain strain of English Romany or gypsies, right?
Yeah, it was English and gypsy and Jewish. And some of it, kind of obscure. I mean, you have to understand that people who were in theater, especially in comedy and especially in comedy for the lower classes, were really people of disrepute.
Yeah.
In terms of the way society looked at them.
Right.
So his mother would have been looked at with great disdain that she was a performer. So he was coming from a background that produced a longing in him for some kind of class.
Yeah.
Produced a great hunger in him. He read everything, especially philosophy, especially Schopenhauer, who's really depressing. He could play the violin and the cello. He played them with his left hand. He was left-handed. He would, during his Senate year, he would walk and walk and walk at night. He had the reputation among his fellow performers of being a complete cheapskate. He wouldn't pay for a drink. He wouldn't drink. His father was an alcoholic, and he hated that all his life. So he wouldn't drink with the guys. He wouldn't gamble. He kept to himself. He wasn't one of the troupe. And when his brother finally came, it was him and his brother. He had affairs, but nothing serious. And he was, he also, and this is, you get from all the accounts of him back then, he was kind of unsanitary. Marie Dressler stopped the production during Tilly, saying that, in those days, collars they were separate from a shirt. A man would have a bunch of collars, and that he'd wear with shirts, cuffs too. I'm not sure how they all attached and everything, but collars were separate. And Marie Dressler couldn't stand it any longer. He'd been wearing the same collar with the same bit of egg on it for several days, and she was not going to play one more scene with this dirty little man unless he changed his collar. And he went off to fetch his car. And you had people who were working there, Minta Durfee and others who you read their remembrances, and they remember a moody guy who had nasty habits, who kept to himself, wasn't much fun. The only person who had fun with him was Mabel. I think because as performers, they were both just brilliant and both complete innovators doing what nobody else was doing. And they understood each other. They studied French together. They weren't an item, as we say, but she was the only one. They do practical jokes. She was the only one he'd do that with. A lot of people did it at the Keystone, but practical jokes were part of the way people dialogued at the Keystone. But he'd only do that kind of thing with Mabel. They would, there'd be a parade, for instance, and Mabel would wrap something up looking like a baby and go, "He's trying to take my baby, he's trying to take my baby." They'd do all this, they'd be doing that kind of thing in public as though everything was a movie. And he was very, very private. He was getting paid by check, and he didn't quite understand what that meant. And he kept, he apparently had enough pocket money, and the Senate noticed that the checks weren't being cashed, and he got Chaplin to please cash the checks, because I don't know how much I really have in my bank account now, because you've got thousands of dollars here not cashed. So he was a very private guy. He remained a very private guy. Very soon he was the boss of his own studio, answering to no one. He had a contract about a year with S&A, then with Mutual. After that, it was all Chaplin. He had his own money. He made his own films exactly the way he wanted. He had 3 or 4 studio sites at, there was one major studio, which was on La Brea below Hollywood Boulevard. I think some of the buildings are still intact. And he stayed a very private person. But in 1914, when the whole future was out there, nobody knew what would happen. Nobody. Cars were just becoming how people got around. You see the films from those days, you don't see that many cars. Downtown LA, you see the most, but not everywhere. people were flying for the first time. You know, it was really a new world, and the movies are part of that. And Chaplin was as surprised as anybody that this was happening to him. He still had visions. You see it in interviews he did as early as 1916. He still had thoughts that maybe he'd become a tragic actor on the stage. He had all kinds of things going on in his head. But he couldn't get away from Charlie. And from beginning in 1914 until the last time he was Charlie in the film Modern Times with Paulette Goddard in the mid-1930s. For those 22 years or so, he amassed one of the great oeuvres, am I pronouncing that right? One of the great works of what was still a very new art. I think that covers it.
Yeah.
As far as I can cover it.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Well, why don't we stop there for today, and then maybe we can move on from there with more about Charlie Chaplin next time. Okay. All right.